It's been 2 years since our first visit to Krat, but Round 8 Studios' brutal puppet masterpiece is back to remind you that it doesn't matter how many hours you have in From Software games, you're still gonna get bullied here. Overture doesn't try to revolutionise the gameplay of Lies of P, changing the core experience in a way that I worried it might from the hack and slashy looking trailers. It does exactly what the base game does. It intrigues you with a bunch of new, very cool weapons and build possibilities. It captivates you with some truly magnificent storytelling. And it stamps your ego into the ground with some of the most fucking batshit enemies and bosses you've ever fought in a video game. There's no surprise in its quality, which overall I would say is just as high, if not higher, than the base game. And if you know how I feel about Lies of P, you know that's as high as praise gets. Overture takes you from fun, whimsical sections of gameplay to some of the most devastating storytelling I've seen in a Souls-like, in an adventure that cements Lies of P as a classic of the genre, standing shoulder to shoulder with the legendary games that inspired it. In this video, I'll tell you my thoughts about Overture, from its rather bizarre launch, the number of quality of life improvements it's added to the base game, its areas, its bosses, a few points of feedback and criticism I have, and just like the first and only other episode of this very rare series, I'll sound the horn and summon the comment section intellectuals by talking about its difficulty. I'll be showing a lot of the DLC in this video, but as always, the audio is completely spoiler free. Welcome to episode 2 of a Souls Nerds review. Overture was shadow dropped at Summer Games Fest, a week after the release of Elden Ring Night Rain. Now, I love the idea of shadow drops when it comes to brand new titles. When it comes to DLC though, especially one that begins in the late game, for which people will want to have characters ready for, it really wasn't ideal. The only character I had was an advanced build I'd done a build guide test run on. It had about half the quartz in the game, and as I couldn't remember what I did and didn't have, I just went in with a very scuffed and arguably underleveled setup. So after completing the DLC, I have one bit of advice for anyone who's stuck in the dilemma of whether to play Overture on New Game Plus or go in with a slightly botched build. Just start a new character. Play through the base game, then do the DLC. And I say that for 3 reasons. First, the mechanics of Lies of P are very different to Souls, and you want to make sure you're on top of all of them. Frames, for example, give you huge damage reduction, in Lies of P's equivalent to armour, but they weigh you down and make you move slower. So when you're locked into a Lies of P playthrough, you take off your armour in running sections and re-equip it for fights. The trouble is that 2023 me took the armour off so he could run faster. And 2025 me loaded in, forgot that was a thing, and spent 3 hours getting one-shot by almost every single attack in the DLC. Second, the fights in this game have their own unique feel and rhythm that's very different to every other title. And if you're a bit rusty on Lies of P combat, you're going into the hardest content in the game on the back foot. I had a muscle memory epiphany about halfway through the DLC where my hands seemed to go, "Oh yeah, I remember this game now." And then I played infinitely better for the rest of the DLC. You'll have much more fun if you have that moment on Scrap Watchman, rather than the monstrous DLC bosses. Thirdly, to refresh yourself on characters and lore. Without spoiling anything, there are plenty of hints and callbacks to characters you know from the base game. And if like me you're a bit rusty on the lore, those moments just won't hit as hard as they should. So start a new playthrough, and you'll thank me. Overture brings a ton of quality of life improvements to both the DLC and the base game. The biggest and most talked about are the two lower difficulty settings, Legendary Stalker, the hardest one, being the old default difficulty. I only spent about 10 minutes playing around with the lower settings, but from what I can tell they are purely mathematical changes. You deal more damage and enemies deal less. There's a new quartz system, allowing you to spend quartz upgrading specific skills rather than just buying new ones. The DLC also makes certain tasks that may have been a little tedious far easier to do. In the base game, if, say, you wanted to upgrade your weapon, spend your quartz, and respec your character, that would involve quite a bit of running and a couple of loading screens. In Overture, this has been made a lot more convenient. There's a new boss rematch feature, allowing you to fight any boss that you've beaten on any character at any time, as well as a boss rush where you can do the fights consecutively. And oh my god, whenever you're in a screen that requires you to have ergo, be it upgrading your weapon or buying from a shop, you can use the right stick to pop any ergo fragments you have directly within the menu. This is a change I didn't know I needed and would have never have asked for. But now every game that doesn't have this feature is going to be annoying. The areas in this DLC are fantastic. Round 8 stuck to their guns in making the areas once again quite linear, although it did feel to me like they had more secrets within them than the base game. In fact, one of the bosses is entirely missable if you're not paying attention. The chances of anyone actually missing it are low, I think, as it's thoughtfully placed in an area you're likely to revisit many times. But the art of making everyone go in the same direction while making each individual player think they've found a secret is something From Software have perfected over the years, and it's one of the best parts of the Souls experience, so it's nice to see that being applied here. This area in particular was a real highlight for me in terms of design and creativity. It reminded me far more of something you'd find in a Haze-like game rather than a Souls-like, with lots of little puzzles and mini-games to solve for more equipment and gear. The contrast between this area's light-heartedness to some of the brutal fights that lurk within it really made this experience feel so unique. When I was done with it, I was gutted that it was over. The story of Overture really blew me away, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. Like Bloodborne's The Old Hunters, Overture reframes a lot of stuff in the base game and gives you a whole new insight into some of its characters, turning some of them into truly tragic figures, while others become more grotesque villains than you ever knew. There is a ton of dialogue in this DLC, and overall I'd say the quality of the voice acting and the scripts is excellent. Jiminy still plays the somewhat Marmitey role of Donkey to your Shrek, but otherwise, from the dialogue of the main characters, to the quiet, sorrow-filled mumblings of the tragic side characters, to the bosses giving you regular updates on precisely how fucked you are, I think they did a really good job here. The base game of Lies of P was the first time I've ever finished a Souls or Souls-like game having read every single scrap of lore I'd picked up, and with Overture, I have now done that twice. As with the base game, the tight and relatively shallow lore of the DLC causes you to interact with it at every opportunity, with almost every scrap giving you interesting info about the place you're in, and hinting at what or who you might find there. The main story is excellent, but what's almost more impressive is the love and thought that's gone into the side quests in this DLC, with all of them telling compelling stories. In some ways it's unfortunate that people like me who play these games over and over aren't generally the type to replay side quests again and again. However, like the very best of From Software, the mark of an amazing side quest is that no matter how many times you run through that area on your latest build, you never, ever forget what happened there. There are so many awesome new enemy designs in the DLC. Overture is not filled exclusively with new enemies. You'll see many returning ones from the base game on your travels, but the new stuff is incredible. Easily on par with From Software's designs. This elite that you meet quite early on is one of my favourites in any Souls or Souls-like game. Quite a simple fight with a simple moveset, but trust me, it grows on you. The elite enemies in Overture really kick things up a notch in comparison to the base game. In fact, at one point you encounter the most dangerous elite in the base game, and after making it through the first few areas of Overture, you think, thank fuck for that, finally an easy fight. Probably the hardest challenge for Overture was for it to match the boss quality of the base game, which was already pretty astonishing. Laxasia from the base game has always been in my top 10 bosses of all time list. Not the Souls-like list, the big list. So when I tell you that I think there now might be 2 bosses from Lies of P in the top 10, that should give you an idea of what you can expect from the boss quality. Overture brings us what might be the most perfectly designed gank fight I've ever fought. And this in particular was a real highlight of the early game, and a reminder of how creative this studio is. As well as being a formidable and fun boss to learn, this one is just so unique. I've never fought a boss like this before in any game, and this unique design opens up so many different ways of doing the fight. You can dodge everything. You can use the quite powerful strat of blocking some attacks while parrying others. Or if you're stubborn, you can try and parry every single attack for a fight that stretches your concentration to breaking point. And just check out the animations. I think you're supposed to be deflated when you get grabbed by a boss, but I just sat there screaming again, like a kid getting off a fairground ride. And this isn't the boss that I like the most. I'm going to show the final boss here, so look away if you're avoiding spoilers. This is one of the craziest bosses I have ever fought. The final boss of this DLC is one of the hardest challenges in the Souls or Souls-like world. Getting this fight down took me a fair bit of practice before it felt consistent. But just like the very best From Software bosses, this wasn't a fight that was painful to learn. Any studio can make a boss that kicks you up and down the arena every time you go near it. But the really special bosses are the ones that can beat the fuck out of you for hours while keeping a massive smile on your face. The last time I spoke about difficulty on this channel was when Lies of P released. Original patch of this game was hilariously brutal, and I worried that new players might bounce off it and miss out on a great adventure. If Overture had released with just the legendary Stalker difficulty setting, I think I might be saying the same thing. However, with the new difficulty levels, it's not an issue. The lower difficulty settings can cater more to casual players, while the original difficulty can remain tough for Souls nerds. In terms of the DLC at the highest difficulty in New Game, and not using summons or relying on consumables, I think it's pretty spot on. In a Lies of P kind of way, because it wouldn't really be Lies of P if random elites weren't stronger than most bosses that you find in other Souls-likes. It's challenging enough that you actually have to learn the enemies before you stand any chance of winning, but in general, forgiving enough to reward good playing without requiring perfection. The game's director has already announced that a patch is coming that will change the difficulty after complaints about it. From what I've read, there does seem to be a problem with DLC scaling on higher new game cycles, so hopefully that was the main cause of complaints. Personally, I hope they don't nerf the bosses too much on Legendary Stalker. I say too much because currently I can't see a world in which the final boss doesn't get a nerf of some kind, but it isn't really something I'd campaign for. In my entire playthrough of Overture, I think genuinely the only bit of bullshit that I came across was the final boss, spoilers, look away now, has an attack where it throws projectiles and attacks you while they're coming for you. It seems really difficult to avoid damage at this point. It's easily blocked, but if he goes for the grab at an awkward moment, it can be pretty frustrating. But genuinely, that's the only attack I remember being troublesome. Everything else is just a case of learning the fights. Overture and Liza P in general sit in the perfect place, for me at least, where the difficulty is still engaging and fun. Laxasia and Melania were both fun fights that took me ages to get my head around, but never felt tedious. Original patch Consort Radahn took me ages to learn and made me hate the fights so much that I ended up being quite relieved when they nerfed him. Overture feels like the former, rather than the latter. I'm really interested to hear the thoughts of anyone who's played on the lower difficulties, particularly if you're new to the game. But that's my thoughts on Legendary Stalker, as a bit of a nerd. I genuinely don't have many complaints about Overture. There's obviously always a desire for more weapons, more areas, more new enemies and more new bosses. I want that for every new game that I like. But after playing Overture, I don't feel in any way shortchanged on the lack of more. This is a long DLC, bigger I would say than any From Software DLC apart from Elden Ring's Shadow expansion. And the quality of the new content more than justifies the cost of entry in my opinion. I think the closest I come to feeling dissatisfied is probably the enemy variety. A few more cool new enemies and a bit less of the base game stuff would have been nice, but again, I don't think it's an issue with this DLC. One thing that is more of an issue is the rewards for getting through Overture. The ergo dropped by bosses and elites really doesn't feel like it's worth the time you invest in fighting them. Through the DLC, I feel like I only leveled up about half a dozen times, each time after a major boss, as that was the only time I ever had enough cash for a level. Considering how tough this DLC is, and how little difference extra levels can make on certain builds, I feel like they could have given us a load more ergo in Overture, without it upsetting the flow of the game. I think this can also affect how people perceive balance. An elite enemy that takes 10 attempts and drops 2000 ergo can feel like a balancing issue, whereas the same enemy dropping enough for a level or two will feel like earned progression. Liza P's gold coin tree still feels like a pretty bizarre choice, with level respecs being gated by this time-based mechanic. I respect my character a bunch of times throughout the DLC to try out different things, and because of my habit of visiting the tree on every trip back to the hub, it was never an issue, but I can only imagine how frustrating it would have been if it had. I appreciate the desire for RPG developers to make respeccing a character come at some cost to the player, but I'm not sure the time-based approach is the most interesting choice. Doing away with this mechanic, if only in the DLC, is something I'm pretty sure that no one would have complained about. Another little quality of life thing I would have loved to see in Overture is an option to duplicate or even buy back boss ergo. The boss equipment in Liza P is so cool, and it would be really nice to be able to use more of it, or have a way to retrieve it if accidentally consumed. And yes, the reason this made it into the review is the gut-wrenching moment I had whilst getting set up for the DLC, where I, in a split second of absent-mindedness, consumed the Swamp Monster's boss ergo. My 2 Dragon Sword Overture adventure doomed to a different playthrough. When I made my first review of Lies of P back in 2023, I made a conscious decision while writing the script not to compare it to Bloodborne. It's too cliché. Not every game with a similar aesthetic needs to be compared to one of the best games of all time. I failed in that script though, and I'm failing again in this one, as Overture did in so many ways remind me of the old Hunters. From the setting, the reframing of its main characters and further exposition of the lore, the weapons. I haven't even spoke about the new weapons in this video, but despite them smashing it out of the park so hard on the base game that it was genuinely hard to think of what more they could add. Just like the old Hunters, Overture adds some brilliant new weapons that are all so unique and encourage completely different playstyles. The music. I haven't spoke about the music either, but do I really need to? It's the Lies of P DLC. The music is exquisite. Of course it is. Like the base game, this DLC constantly reminds you of its inspirations, but shockingly, for a Souls-like, not in a way that's unflattering to itself. Overture closes the book on Lies of P, ending on the highest of highs, and cementing itself alongside the games that inspired it as one of my favourite games of all time. A game that I will always come back to, regardless of what comes next. But what has me so absolutely in awe of this game is the fact that this is still this studio's very first attempt at making a Souls-like. And what has me so excited for the future is the thought that we might be about to witness a studio expand upon and improve its ideas, its storytelling, its mechanics and its world in the same way that From Software has in the last decade. If Lies of P is this studio's Demon's Souls, then my god, the future's going to be special. Thanks for watching.